This is a continuation of Thuvia, Maid of Mars, by Edgar Burroughs, comprising chapters 10 through 12. Chapter 10. Carcomoch, the Bowman. As Carthoris moved through the forest toward the distant cliffs with Thuvia's hand still tight pressed in his, he wondered a little at the girl's continued silence. Yet the contact of her cool palm against his was so pleasant that he feared to break the spell of her newfound reliance in him by speaking. Onward through the dim wood they passed until the shadows of the quick-coming Martian night commenced to close down upon them. Then it was that Carthoris turned to speak to the girl at his side. They must plan together for the future. It was his idea to pass through the cliffs at once if they could locate the passage, and he was quite positive that they were now close to it, but he wanted her assent to the proposition. As his eyes rested upon her, he was struck by her strangely ethereal appearance. She seemed suddenly to have dissolved into the tenuous substance of a dream, and as he continued to gaze upon her, she faded slowly from his sight. For an instant he was dumbfounded, and then the whole truth flashed suddenly upon him. Jav had caused him to believe that Thuvia was accompanying him through the wood while, as a matter of fact, he had detained the girl for himself. Carthoris was horrified. He cursed himself for his stupidity, and yet he knew that the fiendish power which the Lotharian had invoked to confuse him might have deceived any. Scarce had he realized the truth than he had started to retrace his steps toward Lothar, but now he moved at a trot, the earthly thews that he had inherited from his father carrying him swiftly over the soft carpet of fallen leaves and rank grass. Thuvia's brilliant light flooded the plain before the walled city of Lothar as Carthoris broke from the wood opposite the great gate that had given the fugitives egress from the city earlier in the day. At first he saw no indication that there was another than himself anywhere about. The plain was deserted. No myriad bowmen camped now beneath the overhanging verdure of the giant trees. No gory heaps of tortured dead to face the beauty of the scarlet sword. All was silence. All was peace. The Heliumite, scarce pausing at the forest's verge, pushed on across the plain toward the city, when presently he descried a huddled form in the grass at his feet. It was the body of a man lying prone. Carthoris turned the figure over upon its back. It was Jav, but torn and mangled almost beyond recognition. The prince bent low to note if any spark of life remained, and as he did so the lids raised and dull, suffering eyes looked up into his. "The princess of Parth," cried Carthoris. "Where is she? Answer me, man, or I complete the work that another has so well begun." "Kamal," muttered Jav. "He sprang upon me, and would have devoured me but for the girl." Then they went away together into the wood, the girl and the great Banth. "Which way went they?" asked Carthoris. "There," replied Jav faintly, toward the passage through the cliffs. The Prince of Helium waited to hear no more, but springing to his feet, raced back again into the forest. It was dawn when he reached the mouth of the dark tunnel that would lead him to the other world beyond this valley of ghostly memories and strange hypnotic influences and menaces. Within the long, dark passages he met with no accident or obstacle, coming at last into the light of day beyond the mountains, and no great distance from the southern verge of the domains of the Torquasians, not more than 150 had at the most. From the boundary of Torquas to the city of Anther is a distance of some 200 hads, so that the Heliumite had before him a journey of more than 150 earth miles between him and Anther. He could at best but hazard a chance guess that toward Anther Thuvia would take her flight. There lay the nearest water, and there might be expected some day a rescuing party from her father's empire, for Carthoris knew Thuvandine well enough to know that he would leave no stone unturned until he had tracked down the truth as to his daughter's abduction, and learned all that there might be to learn of her whereabouts. He realized, of course, that the trick which had laid suspicion upon him would greatly delay the discovery of the truth, but little did he guess to what vast proportions had the results of the villainy of a stock of Dusar already grown. Even as he emerged from the mouth of the passage to look across the foothills in the direction of Anther, a Parth battle fleet was winging its majestic way slowly toward the twin cities of Helium, while from far distant Kael raced another mighty armada to join forces with its ally. He did not know that in the face of the circumstantial evidence against him, even his own people had commenced to entertain suspicions that he might have stolen the Parthian princess. He did not know of the lengths to which the Dusarians had gone to disrupt the friendship and alliance which existed between the three great powers of the Eastern Hemisphere, Helium, Tarth, and Kael. How Dusarian emissaries had found employment in important posts in the foreign offices of the three great nations, and how, through these men, messages from one Jedak to another were altered and garbled, until the patience and pride of the three rulers and former friends could no longer endure the humiliations and insults contained in these falsified papers. Not any of this he knew. Nor did he know how even to the last John Carter, warlord of Mars, had refused to permit the Jeddak of Helium to declare war against either Parth or Kale, because of his implicit belief in his son, and that eventually all would be satisfactorily explained. And now 2 great fleets were moving upon Helium, while the Ducerian spies at the court of Tardos Mors saw to it that the twin cities remained in ignorance of their danger. War had been declared by Thuvia, but the messenger who had been dispatched with the proclamation had been a Ducerian who had seen to it that no word of warning reached the twin cities of the approach of a hostile fleet. For several days diplomatic relations had been severed between Helium and her 2 most powerful neighbors, and with the departure of the ministers had come a total cessation of wireless communication between the disputants, as is usual upon Barsoom. But of all this Carthoris was ignorant. All that interested him at present was the finding of Thuvia of Parth. Her trail beside that of the huge Banth had been well marked to the tunnel, and was once more visible leading southward into the foothills. As he followed rapidly downward toward the Dead Sea bottom, where he knew he must lose the spoor in the resilient ochre vegetation, he was suddenly surprised to see a naked man approaching him from the northeast. As the fellow drew closer, Carthoris halted to await his coming. He knew that the man was unarmed, and that he was apparently a Lotharian, for his skin was white and his hair auburn. He approached the Heliumite without sign of fear, and when quite close called out the cheery Barsoomian cur of greeting. "Who are you?" asked Carthoris. "I am Carcomoc, Augur of the Bowmen," replied the other. "A strange thing has happened to me. For ages Tario has been bringing me into existence as he needed the services of the army of his mind. Of all the bowmen it has been Carcomoc who has been oftenest materialized. For a long time Tario has been concentrating his mind upon my permanent materialization. It has been an obsession with him that someday this thing could be accomplished and the future of Lothar assured. He asserted that matter was non-existent, except in the imagination of man, that all was mental, and so he believed that by persisting in his suggestion he could eventually make of me a permanent suggestion in the minds of all creatures. Yesterday he succeeded, but at such a time, it must have come all unknown to him, as it came to me without my knowledge, as, with my horde of yelling bowmen, I pursued the fleeing Torquasians back to their ochre plains. As darkness settled and the time came for us to fade once more into thin air, I suddenly found myself alone upon the edge of the great plain which lies yonder at the foot of the low hills. My men were gone back to the nothingness from which they had sprung, but I remained naked and unarmed. At first I could not understand, but at last came a realization of what had occurred. Tario's long suggestions had at last prevailed, and Carcomoc had become a reality in the world of men, but my harness and my weapons had faded away with my fellows, leaving me naked and unarmed in a hostile country far from Lothar. "You wish to return to Lothar?" asked Carthoris. "No," replied Carcomoc quickly. "I have no love for Tario. Being a creature of his mind, I know him too well. He is cruel and tyrannical, a master I have no desire to serve. Now that he has succeeded in accomplishing my permanent materialization, he will be unbearable, and he will go on until he has filled Lothar with his creatures. I wonder if he has succeeded as well with the Maid of Lothar." "I thought there were no women there," said Carthoris. "In a hidden apartment in the palace of Tario," replied Carcomoc. "The Jeddak has maintained the suggestion of a beautiful girl, hoping that someday she would become permanent. I have seen her there. She is wonderful. But for her sake I hope that Tario succeeds not so well with her as he has with me. Now, Red Man, I have told you of myself, what of you?" Carthoris liked the face and manner of the bowman. There had been no sign of doubt or fear in his expression as he had approached the heavily armed Heliumite, and he had spoken directly and to the point. So the Prince of Helium told the bowman of Lothar who he was and what adventure had brought him to this far country. "Good," exclaimed the other when he had done. "Carcomoc will accompany you. Together we shall find the Princess of Parth, and with you Carcomoc will return to the world of men, such a world as he knew in the long-gone past when the ships of mighty Lothar plowed angry Throxus, and the roaring surf beat against the barrier of these parched and dreary hills." "What mean you?" asked Carthoris. "Had you really a former actual existence?" "Most assuredly," replied Carcomoc. "In my day I commanded the fleets of Lothar, mightiest of all the fleets that sailed the 5 salt seas. Wherever men lived upon Barsoom there was the name of Carcomoc known and respected. Peaceful were the land races in those distant days, only the seafarers were warriors. But now has the glory of the past faded, nor did I think until I met you that there remained upon Barsoom a single person of our own mold who lived and loved and fought as did the ancient seafarers of my time. Ah, but it will seem good to see men once again, real men. Never had I much respect for the landsmen of my day. They remained in their walled cities, wasting their time in play, depending for their protection entirely upon the sea race. And the poor creatures who remain, the Tarios and Jabs of Lothar, are even worse than their ancient forebears. Carthoris was a trifle skeptical as to the wisdom of permitting the stranger to attach himself to him. There was always the chance that he was but the essence of some hypnotic treachery which Tario or Jab was attempting to exert upon the Heliumite. And yet, so sincere had been the manner and the words of the bowman, so much the fighting man did he seem, but Carthoris could not find it in his heart to doubt him. The outcome of the matter was that he gave the naked Oddwar leave to accompany him, and together they set out upon the spoor of Thuvia and Komal. Down to the ochre sea bottom the trail led. There it disappeared, as Carthoris had known that it would, but where it entered the plain its direction had been toward Aenther, and so toward Aenther the two turned their faces. It was a long and tedious journey fraught with many dangers. The bowman could not travel at the pace set by Carthoris, whose muscles carried him with great rapidity over the face of the small planet, the force of gravity of which exerts so much less retarding power than that of the earth. 50 miles a day is a fair average for a Barsoomian, but the son of John Carter might easily have covered 100 or more miles had he cared to desert his newfound comrade. All the way they were in constant danger of discovery by roving bands of Torquasians, and especially was this true before they reached the boundary of Torquas. Good fortune was with them, however, and although they sighted 2 detachments of the savage green men, they were not themselves seen. And so they came, upon the morning of the 3rd day, within sight of the glistening domes of distant Aenther. Throughout the journey Carthoris had ever strained his eyes ahead in search of Thuvia and the great Banth, but not till now had he seen aught to give him hope. This morning, far ahead, halfway between themselves and Aenther, the men saw 2 tiny figures moving toward the city. For a moment they watched them intently. Then Carthoris, convinced, leaped forward at a rapid run, Carcomoc following as swiftly as he could. The Heliumite shouted to attract the girl's attention, and presently he was rewarded by seeing her turn and stand looking toward him. At her side the great Banth stood with up-pricked ears, watching the approaching man. Not yet could Thuvia of Parth have recognized Carthoris, though that it was he she must have been convinced, for she waited there for him without sign of fear. Presently he saw her point toward the northwest beyond him. Without slackening his pace, he turned his eyes in the direction she indicated. Racing silently over the thick vegetation, not half a mile behind, came a score of fierce green warriors, charging him upon their mighty thoats. To their right was Carcomoc, naked and unarmed, yet running valiantly toward Carthoris and shouting warning as though he, too, had but just discovered the silent, menacing company that moved so swiftly forward with couched spears and ready long swords. Carthoris shouted to the Lotharian, warning him back, for he knew that he could but uselessly sacrifice his life by placing himself, all unarmed, in the path of the cruel and relentless savages. But Carcomoc never hesitated. With shouts of encouragement to his new friend, he hurried onward toward the Prince of Helium. The red man's heart leaped in response to this exhibition of courage and self-sacrifice. He regretted now that he had not thought to give Carcomoc one of his swords, but it was too late to attempt it, for should he wait for the Lotharian to overtake him or return to meet him, the Torquasians would reach Thuvia of Parth before he could do so. Even as it was, it would be nip and tuck as to who came first to her side. Again he turned his face in her direction, and now from Aenther way he saw a new force hastening toward them, 2 medium-sized warcraft, and even at the distance they still were from him, he discerned the device of Dusar upon their bows. Now, indeed, seemed little hope for Thuvia of Parth, with savage warriors of the hordes of Torquas charging toward her from one direction, and no less implacable enemies, in the form of the creatures of Astok, Prince of Dusar, bearing down upon her from another, while only a Banth, a red warrior, and an unarmed bowman were near to defend her. Her plight was quite hopeless and her cause already lost ere ever it was contested. As Thuvia saw Carthoris approaching, she felt again that unaccountable sensation of entire relief from responsibility and fear that she had experienced upon a former occasion. Nor could she account for it while her mind still tried to convince her heart that the Prince of Helium had been instrumental in her abduction from her father's court. She only knew that she was glad when he was by her side, and that with him there all things seemed possible, even such impossible things as escape from her present predicament. Now had he stopped, panting, before her. A brave smile of encouragement lit his face. "Courage, my princess," he whispered. To the girl's memory flashed the occasion upon which he had used those same words in the throne room of Tario of Lothar as they had commenced to slip down the sinking marble floor toward an unknown fate. Then she had not chidden him for the use of that familiar salutation, nor did she chide him now, though she was promised to another. She wondered at herself, flushing at her own turpitude. For upon Barsoom it is a shameful thing for a woman to listen to those two words from another than her husband or her betrothed. Carthoris saw her flush of mortification, and in an instant regretted his words. There was but a moment before the green warriors would be upon them. "Forgive me," said the man in a low voice. "Let my great love be my excuse that, and the belief that I have but a moment more of life." And with the words he turned to meet the foremost of the green warriors. The fellow was charging with couched spear, but Carthoris leaped to one side, and as the great thoat and its rider hurtled harmlessly past him, he swung his long sword in a mighty cut that clove the green carcass in twain. At the same moment Carcomac leaped with bare hands, clawing at the leg of another of the huge riders. The balance of the horde raced into close quarters, dismounting the better to wield their favorite long swords. The Ducerian flyers touched the soft carpet of the ochre-charred sea bottom, disgorging 50 fighting men from their bowels, and into the swirling sea of cutting, slashing swords sprang Komal, the great Banth. Chapter 11. Green Men and White Apes. A Torquasian sword smote a glancing blow across the forehead of Carthoris. He had a fleeting vision of soft arms about his neck, and warm lips close to his before he lost consciousness. How long he lay there senseless he could not guess, but when he opened his eyes again he was alone, except for the bodies of the dead green men and Ducerians, and the carcass of a great Banth that lay half across his own. Thuvia was gone, nor was the body of Carcomac among the dead. Weak from loss of blood, Carthoris made his way slowly toward Anther, reaching its outskirts at dark. He wanted water more than any other thing, and so he kept on up a broad avenue toward the great central plaza, where he knew the precious fluid was to be found in a half-ruined building opposite the great palace of the ancient Jedak, who once had ruled this mighty city. Disheartened and discouraged by the strange sequence of events that seemed foreordained to thwart his every attempt to serve the Princess of Parth, he paid little or no attention to his surroundings, moving through the deserted city as though no great white apes lurked in the black shadows of the mystery-haunted piles that flanked the broad avenues in the great plaza. But if Carthoris was careless of his surroundings, not so other eyes that watched his entrance into the plaza, and followed his slow footsteps toward the marble pile that housed the tiny, half-choked spring whose water one might gain only by scratching a deep hole in the red sand that covered it. And as the Heliumite entered the small building, a dozen mighty, grotesque figures emerged from the doorway of the palace to speed noiselessly across the plaza toward him. For half an hour Carthoris remained in the building, digging for water and gaining the few much-needed drops which were the fruits of his labor. Then he rose and slowly left the structure. Scarce had he stepped beyond the threshold than 12 Torquasian warriors leaped upon him. No time then to draw a long sword, but swift from his harness flew his long slim dagger, and as he went down beneath them more than a single green heart ceased beating at the bite of that keen point. Then they overpowered him and took his weapons away, but only 9 of the 12 warriors who had crossed the plaza returned with their prize. They dragged their prisoner roughly to the palace pits, where in utter darkness they chained him with rusty links to the solid masonry of the wall. "Tomorrow Tharban will speak with you," they said. "Now he sleeps, but great will be his pleasure when he learns who has wandered amongst us, and great will be the pleasure of Hortengur when Tharban drags before him the mad fool who dared prick the great Jeddak with his sword." Then they left him to the silence and the darkness. For what seemed hours Carthoris squatted upon the stone floor of his prison, his back against the wall in which was sunk the heavy eye-bolt that secured the chain which held him. Then, from out of the mysterious blackness before him, there came to his ears the sound of naked feet moving stealthily upon stone, approaching nearer and nearer to where he lay, unarmed and defenseless. Minutes passed, minutes that seemed hours, during which time periods of sepulchral silence would be followed by a repetition of the uncanny scraping of naked feet slinking warily upon him. At last he heard a sudden rush of unshod souls across the empty blackness, and at a little distance a scuffling sound, heavy breathing, and once what he thought the muttered imprecation of a man battling against great odds. Then the clanging of a chain and a noise as of the snapping back against stone of a broken link. Again came silence, but for a moment only. Now he heard once more the soft feet approaching him. He thought that he discerned wicked eyes gleaming fearfully at him through the darkness. He knew that he could hear the heavy breathing of powerful lungs. Then came the rush of many feet toward him, and the things were upon him. Hands terminating in man-like fingers clutched at his throat, and arms and legs, hairy body strained and struggled against his own smooth hide as he battled in grim silence against these horrid foemen in the darkness of the pits of ancient Aether. Though like some giant god was Carthoris of Helium, yet in the clutches of these unseen creatures of the pit's Stygian night he was helpless as a frail woman. Yet he battled on, striking futile blows against great, hispid breasts he could not see, feeling thick, squat throats beneath his fingers, the drool of saliva upon his cheek, and hot, foul breath in his nostrils. Fangs, too, mighty fangs he knew were close, and why they did not sink into his flesh he could not guess. At last he became aware of the mighty surging of a number of his antagonists back and forth upon the great chain that held him, and presently came the same sound that he had heard at a little distance from him. A short time before he had been attacked, his chain had parted and the broken end snapped back against the stone wall. Now he was seized upon either side and dragged at a rapid pace through the dark corridors toward what fate he could not even guess. At first he had thought his foes might be of the tribe of Torquas, but their hairy bodies belied that belief. Now he was at last quite sure of their identity, though why they had not killed and devoured him at once he could not imagine. After half an hour or more of rapid racing through the underground passages that are a distinguishing feature of all Barsoomian cities, modern as well as ancient, his captors suddenly emerged into the moonlight of a courtyard, far from the central plaza. Immediately Carthoris saw that he was in the power of a tribe of the great white apes of Barsoom. All that had caused him doubt before as to the identity of his attackers was the hairiness of their breasts, for the white apes are entirely hairless except for a great shock bristling from their heads. Now he saw the cause of that which had deceived him. Across the chest of each of them were strips of hairy hide, usually of banth, in imitation of the harness of the green warriors who so often camped at their deserted city. Carthoris had read of the existence of tribes of apes that seemed to be progressing slowly toward higher standards of intelligence. Into the hands of such he realized he had fallen, but what were their intentions toward him? As he glanced about the courtyard he saw fully 50 of the hideous beasts, squatting on their haunches, and at a little distance from him another human being, closely guarded. As his eyes met those of his fellow captive a smile lit the other's face, and K, or Red Man, burst from his lips. It was Carcomoc the bowman. Care, cried Carthoris in response. How came you here, and what befell the princess? Red men like yourself descended in mighty ships that sailed the air, even as the great ships of my distant day sailed the 5 seas, replied Carcomoc. They fought with the green men of Torquas. They slew Kamal, god of Lothar. I thought they were your friends, and I was glad when finally those of them who survived the battle carried the red girl to one of the ships and sailed away with her into the safety of the high air. Then the green men seized me and carried me to a great, empty city, where they chained me to a wall in a black pit. Afterward came these and dragged me hither. And what of you, Red Man? Carthoris related all that had befallen him, and as the 2 men talked the great ape squatted about them watching them intently. What are we to do now? Asked the bowman. Our case looks rather hopeless, replied Carthoris ruefully. These creatures are born man-eaters. Why they have not already devoured us I cannot imagine there, he whispered. See, the end is coming. Carcomoc looked in the direction Carthoris indicated to see a huge ape advancing with a mighty bludgeon. It is thus they like best to kill their prey, said Carthoris. Must we die without a struggle? Asked Carcomoc. Not I, replied Carthoris, though I know how futile our best defense must be against these mighty brutes. Oh, for a long sword. Or a good bow, added Carcomoc, and a Utin of bowmen. At the words Carthoris half sprang to his feet, only to be dragged roughly down by his guard. Carcomoc, he cried, why cannot you do what Tario and Jav did? They had no bowmen other than those of their own creation. You must know the secret of their power. Call forth your own Utin, Carcomoc. The Lotharian looked at Carthoris in wide-eyed astonishment as the full purport of the suggestion bore in upon his understanding. Why not? He murmured. The savage ape bearing the mighty bludgeon was slinking toward Carthoris. The Heliumate's fingers were working as he kept his eyes upon his executioner. Carcomoc bent his gaze penetratingly upon the apes. The effort of his mind was evidenced in the sweat upon his contracted brows. The creature that was to slay the Red Man was almost within arm's reach of his prey, when Carthoris heard a hoarse howl from the opposite side of the courtyard. In common with the squatting apes and the demon with the club, he turned in the direction of the sound, to see a company of sturdy bowmen rushing from the doorway of a nearby building. With screams of rage the apes leaped to their feet to meet the charge. A volley of arrows met them halfway, sending a dozen rolling lifeless to the ground. Then the apes closed with their adversaries. All their attention was occupied by the attackers. Even the guard had deserted the prisoners to join in the battle. "Come," whispered Carcomoc. "Now may we escape while their attention is diverted from us by my bowmen." "And leave those brave fellows leaderless," cried Carthoris, whose loyal nature revolted at the merest suggestion of such a thing. Carcomoc laughed. "You forget," he said, "that they are but thin air figments of my brain. They will vanish unscathed when we have no further need for them. Praised be your first ancestor, Redmen, that you thought of this chance in time. It would never have occurred to me to imagine that I might wield the same power that brought me into existence." "You are right," said Carthoris. "Still I hate to leave them, though there is naught else to do." And so the two turned from the courtyard, and making their way into one of the broad avenues, crept stealthily in the shadows of the building toward the great central plaza upon which were the buildings occupied by the Green Warriors when they visited the deserted city. When they had come to the plaza's edge, Carthoris halted. "Wait here," he whispered. "I go to fetch Thotes, since on foot we may never hope to escape the clutches of these green fiends." To reach the courtyard where the Thotes were kept, it was necessary for Carthoris to pass through one of the buildings which surrounded the square, which were occupied, and which not he could not even guess, so he was compelled to take considerable chances to gain the enclosure in which he could hear the restless beasts squealing and quarreling among themselves. Chance carried him through a dark doorway into a large chamber, in which lay a score or more green warriors wrapped in their sleeping silks and furs. Scarce had Carthoris passed through the short hallway that connected the door of the building and the great room beyond it than he became aware of the presence of something or someone in the hallway through which he had but just passed. He heard a man yawn, and then, behind him, he saw the figure of a sentry rise from where the fellow had been dozing, and stretching himself resume his wakeful watchfulness. Carthoris realized that he must have passed within a foot of the warrior, doubtless rousing him from his slumber. To retreat now would be impossible. Yet to cross through that room full of sleeping warriors seemed almost equally beyond the pale of possibility. Carthoris shrugged his broad shoulders and chose the lesser evil. Warily he entered the room. At his right, against the wall, leaned several swords and rifles and spears, extra weapons which the warriors had stacked here ready to their hands should there be a night alarm calling them suddenly from slumber. Beside each sleeper lay his weapon. These were never far from their owners from childhood to death. The sight of the swords made the young man's palm itch. He stepped quickly to them, selecting two short swords, one for Carcomoc, the other for himself, also some trappings for his naked comrade. Then he started directly across the center of the apartment among the sleeping Torquasians. Not a man of them moved until Carthoris had completed more than half of the short though dangerous journey. Then a fellow directly in his path turned restlessly upon his sleeping silks and furs. The Heliumite paused above him, one of the short swords in readiness should the warrior awaken. For what seemed an eternity to the young prince, the green man continued to move uneasily upon his couch. Then, as though actuated by springs, he leaped to his feet and faced the red man. Instantly Carthoris struck, but not before a savage grunt escaped the other's lips. In an instant the room was in turmoil. Warriors leaped to their feet, grasping their weapons as they rose, and shouting to one another for an explanation of the disturbance. To Carthoris all within the room was plainly visible in the dim light reflected from without, for the further moon stood directly at zenith, but to the eyes of the newly awakened green men objects as yet had not taken on familiar forms. They but saw vaguely the figures of warriors moving about their apartment. Now one stumbled against the corpse of him whom Carthoris had slain. The fellow stooped and his hand came in contact with the cleft skull. He saw about him the giant figures of other green men, and so he jumped to the only conclusion that was open to him. "The Thirds," he cried. "The Thirds are upon us. Rise, warriors of Torquas, and drive home your swords within the hearts of Torqu's ancient enemies." Instantly the green men began to fall upon one another with naked swords. Their savage lust of battle was aroused. To fight, to kill, to die with cold steel buried in their vitals. That to them was nirvana. Carthoris was quick to guess their error and take advantage of it. He knew that in the pleasure of killing they might fight on long after they had discovered their mistake, unless their attention was distracted by sight of the real cause of the altercation, and so he lost no time in continuing across the room to the doorway upon the opposite side, which opened into the inner court, where the savage Thotes were squealing and fighting among themselves. Once here he had no easy task before him. To catch and mount one of these habitually rageful and intractable beasts was no child's play under the best of conditions, but now, when silence and time were such important considerations, it might well have seemed quite hopeless to a less resourceful and optimistic man than the son of the great warlord. From his father he had learned much concerning the traits of these mighty beasts, and from Tars Tarkas, also when he had visited that great green Jedak among his horde at Thark. So now he centered upon the work in hand all that he had ever learned about them from others, and from his own experience, for he, too, had ridden and handled them many times. The temper of the Thoats of Torquas appeared even shorter than their vicious cousins among the Tharks and Warhoons, and for a time it seemed unlikely that he should escape a savage charge on the part of a couple of old bulls that circled, squealing, about him. But at last he managed to get close enough to one of them to touch the beast. With the feel of his hand upon the sleek hide the creature quieted, and in answer to the telepathic command of the red man sank to its knees. In a moment Carthoris was upon its back, guiding it toward the great gate that leads from the courtyard through a large building at one end into an avenue beyond. The other bull, still squealing and enraged, followed after his fellow. There was no bridle upon either, for these strange creatures are controlled entirely by suggestion when they are controlled at all. Even in the hands of the giant green men bridle reins would be hopelessly futile against the mad savagery and mastodonic strength of the Thoat, and so they are guided by that strange telepathic power with which the men of Mars have learned to communicate in a crude way with the lower orders of their planet. With difficulty Carthoris urged the two beasts to the gate, where leaning down he raised the latch. Then the Thoat that he was riding placed his great shoulder to the skeel wood planking, pushed through, and a moment later the man and the two beasts were swinging silently down the avenue to the edge of the plaza, where Carcomac hid. Here Carthoris found considerable difficulty in subduing the second Thoat, and as Carcomac had never before ridden one of the beasts, it seemed a most hopeless job. But at last the bowman managed to scramble to the sleek back, and again the two beasts fled softly down the moss-grown avenues toward the open sea bottom beyond the city. All that night and the following day and the second night they rode toward the northeast. No indication of pursuit developed, and at dawn of the second day Carthoris saw in the distance the waving ribbon of great trees that marked one of the long Barsumian waterways. Immediately they abandoned their Thoats and approached the cultivated district on foot. Carthoris also discarded the metal from his harness, or such of it as might serve to identify him as a Helium eater or of royal blood, for he did not know to what nation belonged this waterway, and upon Mars it is always well to assume every man and nation your enemy, until you have learned the contrary. It was mid-forenoon when the two at last entered one of the roads that cut through the cultivated districts at regular intervals, joining the arid wastes on either side with the great, white, central highway that follows through the center from end to end of the far-reaching, thread-like farmlands. The high wall surrounding the field served as a protection against surprise by raiding green hordes, as well as keeping the savage bants and other carnivora from the domestic animals and the human beings upon the farms. Carthoris stopped before the first gate he came to, pounding for admission. The young man who answered his summons greeted the two hospitably, though he looked with considerable wonder upon the white skin and auburn hair of the bowman. After he had listened for a moment to a partial narration of their escape from the Torquasians, he invited them within, took them to his house, and bade the servants there prepare food for them. As they waited in the low-ceiled, pleasant living room of the farmhouse until the meal should be ready, Carthoris drew his host into conversation that he might learn his nationality, and thus the nation under whose dominion lay the waterway where circumstance had placed him. "I am Hal Vass," said the young man, son of Vaskor of Dusar, a noble in the retinue of Ostok, Prince of Dusar. "At present I am dwarf of the road for this district." Carthoris was very glad that he had not disclosed his identity, for though he had no idea of anything that had transpired since he had left Helium, or that Ostok was at the bottom of all his misfortunes, he well knew that the Dusarian had no love for him, and that he could hope for no assistance within the dominions of Dusar. "And who are you?" asked Hal Vass. "By your appearance I take you for a fighting man, but I see no insignia upon your harness. Can it be that you are a Panthan?" Now these wandering soldiers of fortune are common upon Barsum, where most men love to fight. They sell their services wherever war exists, and in the occasional brief intervals when there is no organized warfare between the Red Nations, they join one of the numerous expeditions that are constantly being dispatched against the Green Men in protection of the waterways that traverse the wilder portions of the globe. When their service is over, they discard the metal of the nation they have been serving until they shall have found a new master. In the intervals they wear no insignia, their war-worn harness and grim weapons being sufficient to attest their calling. The suggestion was a happy one, and Carthoris embraced the chance it afforded to account satisfactorily for himself. There was, however, a single drawback. In times of war, such Panthans as happened to be within the domain of a belligerent nation were compelled to don the insignia of that nation and fight with her warriors. As far as Carthoris knew, Dusar was not at war with any other nation, but there was never any telling when one red nation would be flying at the throat of a neighbor, even though the great and powerful alliance at the head of which was his father, John Carter, had managed to maintain a long peace upon the greater portion of Barsoom. A pleasant smile lighted Hal's vast face as Carthorus admitted his vocation. "It is well," exclaimed the young man, "that you chance to come hither, for here you will find the means of obtaining service in short order. My father, Vascour, is even now with me, having come hither to recruit a force for the new war against Helium." Chapter 12. To save Dusar. Thuvia of Parth, battling for more than life against the lust of Jav, cast a quick glance over her shoulder toward the forest from which had rumbled the fierce growl. Jav looked too. What they saw filled each with apprehension. It was Komal, the Banth god, rushing wide-jawed upon them. Which had he chosen for his prey? Or was it to be both? They had not long to wait, for though the Lotharian attempted to hold the girl between himself and the terrible fangs, the great beast found him at last. Then, shrieking, he attempted to fly toward Lothar, after pushing Thuvia bodily into the face of the man-eater. But his flight was of short duration. In a moment Komal was upon him, rending his throat and chest with demoniacal fury. The girl reached their side a moment later, but it was with difficulty that she tore the mad beast from its prey. Still growling and casting hungry glances back upon Jav, the Banth at last permitted itself to be led away into the wood. With her giant protector by her side, Thuvia set forth to find the passage through the cliffs, that she might attempt the seemingly impossible feat of reaching far distant Parth across the more than 17,000 hads of savage Barsoom. She could not believe that Carthorus had deliberately deserted her, and so she kept a constant watch for him. But as she bore too far to the north in her search for the tunnel, she passed the Heliumite as he was returning to Lothar in search of her. Thuvia of Parth was having difficulty in determining the exact status of the Prince of Helium in her heart. She could not admit even to herself that she loved him, and yet she had permitted him to apply to her that term of endearment and possession to which a Barsoomian maid should turn deaf ears when voiced by other lips than those of her husband or fiancé. My princess. Kulan Tith, Jedak of Kaul, to whom she was affianced, commanded her respect and admiration. Had it been that she had surrendered to her father's wishes because of pique, that the handsome Heliumite had not taken advantage of his visits to her father's court to push the suit for her hand that she had been quite sure he had contemplated since that distant day the two had sat together upon the carved seat within the gorgeous garden of the Jedaks that graced the inner courtyard of the palace of Silensis Ola Kadabra. Did she love Kulan Tith? Bravely she tried to believe that she did, but all the while her eyes wandered through the coming darkness for the figure of a clean-limbed fighting man, black-haired and gray-eyed. Black was the hair of Kulan Tith, but his eyes were brown. It was almost dark when she found the entrance to the tunnel. Safely she passed through to the hills beyond, and here, under the bright light of Mars' two moons, she halted to plan her future action. Should she wait here in the hope that Carthorus would return in search of her? Or should she continue her way northeast toward Parth? Where, first, would Carthorus have gone after leaving the valley of Lothar? Her parched throat and dry tongue gave her the answer toward Aantherwisser and water. Well, she too would go first to Aanther, where she might find more than the water she needed. With Komal by her side she felt little fear, for he would protect her from all other savage beasts. Even the great white apes would flee the mighty Banth in terror. Men only need she fear, but she must take this and many other chances before she could hope to reach her father's court again. When at last Carthorus found her, only to be struck down by the long sword of a green man, Thuvia prayed that the same fate might overtake her. The sight of the red warriors leaping from their flyers had, for a moment, filled her with renewed hope that Carthorus of Helium might be only stunned, and that they would rescue him. But when she saw the Dusarian metal upon their harness, and that they sought only to escape with her alone from the charging Torquesians, she gave up. Komal, too, was dead across the body of the Heliumite. She was indeed alone now. There was none to protect her. The Dusarian warriors dragged her to the deck of the nearest flyer. All about them the green warriors surged in an attempt to wrest her from the red. At last those who had not died in the conflict gained the decks of the two craft. The engines throbbed and purred the propellers word. Quickly the swift boat shot heavenward. Thuvia of Parth glanced about her. A man stood near, smiling down into her face. With a gasp of recognition she looked full into his eyes, and then with a little moan of terror and understanding she buried her face in her hands and sank to the polished skeel wood deck. It was Astok, Prince of Dusar, who bent above her. Swift were the flyers of Astok of Dusar, and great the need for reaching his father's court as quickly as possible, for the fleets of war of Helium, and Parth and Kael were scattered far and wide above Barsoom. Nor would it go well with Astok of Dusar should any one of them discover Thuvia of Parth a prisoner upon his own vessel. Aanther lies in 50 south latitude and 40 east of Horus, the deserted seat of ancient Barsoomian culture and learning, while Dusar lies 15 degrees north of the equator and 20 degrees east from Horus. Great though the distance is, the flyers covered it without a stop. Long before they had reached their destination, Thuvia of Parth had learned several things that cleared up the doubts that had assailed her mind for many days. Scarce had they risen above Aanther than she recognized one of the crew as a member of the crew of that other flyer that had borne her from her father's gardens to Aanther. The presence of a stock upon the craft settled the whole question. She had been stolen by emissaries of the Dusarian Prince Carthoris of Helium had had nothing to do with it. Nor did a stock deny the charge when she accused him. He only smiled and pleaded his love for her. "I would sooner mate with a white ape," she cried when he would have urged his suit. A stock glowered sullenly upon her. "You shall mate with me, Thuvia of Parth," he growled, "or by your first ancestor, you shall have your preference and mate with a white ape." The girl made no reply, nor could he draw her into conversation during the balance of the journey. As a matter of fact, Astok was a trifle awed by the proportions of the conflict which his abduction of the Parthian princess had induced, nor was he over-comfortable with the weight of responsibility which the possession of such a prisoner entailed. His one thought was to get her to Dusar, and there let his father assume the responsibility. In the meantime, he would be as careful as possible to do nothing to affront her, lest they all might be captured and he have to account for his treatment of the girl to one of the great Jedeks, whose interests centered in her. And so at last they came to Dusar, where Astok hid his prisoner in a secret room high in the east tower of his own palace. He had sworn his men to silence in the matter of the identity of the girl, for until he had seen his father, Nutis, Jeddak of Dusar, he dared not let anyone know whom he had brought with him from the south. But when he appeared in the great audience chamber before the cruel-lipped man, who was his sire, he found his courage oozing, and he dared not speak of the princess hid within his palace. It occurred to him to test his father's sentiments upon the subject, and so he told a tale of capturing one who claimed to know the whereabouts of Thuvia of Parth. "And if you command it, sire," he said, "I will go and capture her, fetching her here to Dusar." Nutis frowned and shook his head. "You have done enough already to set Parth and Kael and Helium all three upon us at once should they learn your part in the theft of the Parth princess. That you succeeded in shifting the guilt upon the Prince of Helium was fortunate, and a masterly move of strategy, but were the girl to know the truth and ever return to her father's court, all Dusar would have to pay the penalty, and to have her here a prisoner amongst us would be an admission of guilt from the consequences of which naught could save us. It would cost me my throne, a stock, and that I have no mind to lose." "If we had her here," the elder man suddenly commenced to muse, repeating the phrase again and again. "If we had her here, a stock," he exclaimed fiercely. "Ah, if we but had her here and none knew that she was here. Can you not guess, man? The guilt of Dusar might be forever buried with her bones," he concluded in a low, savage whisper. A stock, Prince of Dusar, shuddered. Weak he was, yes, and wicked too, but the suggestion that his father's words implied turned him cold with horror. Cruel to their enemies are the men of Mars, but the word enemies is commonly interpreted to mean men only. Assassination runs riot in the great Barsoomian cities, yet to murder a woman is a crime so unthinkable that even the most hardened of the paid assassins would shrink from you in horror, should you suggest such a thing to him. Nutis was apparently oblivious to his son's all too patent terror at his suggestion. Presently he continued. You say that you know where the girl lies hid, since she was stolen from your people at Aanther. Should she be found by any one of the three powers, her unsupported story would be sufficient to turn them all against us. "There is but one way, Astok," cried the older man. "You must return at once to her hiding place and fetch her hither in all secrecy. And look you here. Return not to Dusar without her, upon pain of death." Astok, Prince of Dusar, well knew his royal father's temper. He knew that in the tyrant's heart there pulsed no single throb of love for any creature. Astok's mother had been a slave woman. Nutis had never loved her. He had never loved another. In youth he had tried to find a bride at the courts of several of his powerful neighbors, but their women would have none of him. After a dozen daughters of his own nobility had sought self-destruction rather than wed him, he had given up. And then it had been that he had legally wed one of his slaves that he might have a son to stand among the Jeds when Nutis died and a new Jedek was chosen. Slowly Astok withdrew from the presence of his father. With white face and shaking limbs he made his way to his own palace. As he crossed the courtyard his glance chanced to wander to the great east tower looming high against the azure of the sky. At sight of it, beads of sweat broke out upon his brow. Issus. No other hand than his could be trusted to do the horrid thing. With his own fingers he must crush the life from that perfect throat, or plunge the silent blade into the red heart. Her heart. The heart that he had hoped would brim with love for him. But had it done so? He recalled the haughty contempt with which his protestations of love had been received. He went cold and then hot to the memory of it. His compunctions cooled as the self-satisfaction of a near revenge crowded out the finer instincts that had for a moment asserted themselves. The good that he had inherited from the slave woman was once again submerged in the bad blood that had come down to him from his royal sire, as, in the end, it always was. A cold smile supplanted the terror that had dilated his eyes. He turned his steps toward the tower. He would see her before he set out upon the journey that was to blind his father to the fact that the girl was already in Dusar. Quietly he passed in through the secret way, ascending a spiral runway to the apartment in which the Princess of Tarth was immured. As he entered the room, he saw the girl leaning upon the sill of the east casement, gazing out across the rooftops of Dusar toward distant Parth. He hated Parth. The thought of it filled him with rage. Why not finish her now and have it done with? At the sound of his steps, she turned quickly toward him. Ah, how beautiful she was! His sudden determination faded beneath the glorious light of her wondrous beauty. He would wait until he had returned from his little journey of deception. Maybe there might be some other way then. Some other hand to strike the blow with that face, with those eyes before him. He could never do it. Of that he was positive. He had always gloried in the cruelty of his nature, but Issus, he was not that cruel. No, another must be found, one whom he could trust. He was still looking at her as she stood there before him, meeting his gaze steadily and unafraid. He felt the hot passion of his love mounting higher and higher. Why not sue once more? If she would relent, all might yet be well. Even if his father could not be persuaded, they could fly to Parth, laying all the blame of the knavery and intrigue that had thrown 4 great nations into war upon the shoulders of Nudis. And who was there that would doubt the justice of the charge? Thuvia, he said, I come once again for the last time to lay my heart at your feet. Tarth and Kale and Dusar are battling with Helium because of you. Wed me, Thuvia, and all may yet be as it should be. The girl shook her head. Wait, he commanded, before she could speak. Know the truth before you speak words that may seal not only your own fate, but that of the thousands of warriors who battle because of you. Refuse to wed me willingly, and Dusar would be laid waste should ever the truth be known to Parth and Kale and Helium. They would raze our cities, leaving not one stone upon another. They would scatter our peoples across the face of Barsoom from the frozen north to the frozen south, hunting them down and slaying them, until this great nation remained only as a hated memory in the minds of men. But while they are exterminating the Dusarians, countless thousands of their own warriors must perish, and all because of the stubbornness of a single woman who would not wed the prince who loves her. Refuse, Thuvia of Parth, and there remains but a single alternative. No man must ever know your fate. Only a handful of loyal servitors besides my royal father and myself know that you were stolen from the gardens of Thuvandine by Astok, Prince of Dusar, or that today you be imprisoned in my palace. Refuse, Thuvia of Parth, and you must die to save Dusar. There is no other way. Nutis the Jedak has so decreed. I have spoken. For a long moment the girl let her level gaze rest full upon the face of Astok of Dusar. Then she spoke, and though the words were few, the unimpassioned tone carried unfathomable depths of cold contempt. Better all that you have threatened, she said, than you. Then she turned her back upon him, and went to stand once more before the east window, gazing with sad eyes toward distant Parth. Astok wheeled and left the room, returning after a short interval of time with food and drink. Here, he said, is sustenance until I return again. The next to enter this apartment will be your executioner. Commend yourself to your ancestors, Thuvia of Parth, for within a few days you shall be with them. Then he was gone. Half an hour later he was interviewing an officer high in the navy of Dusar. Whither went Vascour? He asked. He is not at his palace. South, to the great waterway that skirts Torquas, replied the other. His son Halvas is door of the road there, and thither has Vascour gone to enlist recruits among the workers on the farms. Good, said Astok, and a half hour more found him rising above Dusar in his swiftest flyer. This concludes the 5th part of 6 total of Thuvia, Maid of Mars, by Edgar Rice Burroughs, produced by Best Audiobooks for free.